So I woke up to an email this morning saying, Carlin, you were in the New York Times. And I said, what? And they sent me this article, and apparently I'm not actually in it. I'm like in the background in one of the photos. We'll see if you can spot me in it. But it's this article, What's Next for Trump Voters Who Believe the Election Was Stolen? Now, YouTube, with your censoring YouTube guidelines, I want to point out that I'm literally going to read an article from the New York Times. And this is going to be my little experiment to see if you do your YouTube censorship thing and take the video down. Literally an article from the New York Times. But I thought that this would be kind of a fun article to just do a little reaction video to. I want to know what the New York Times thinks is in store for, let's just say, maybe people like me who maybe believe that based on the New York Times headline, YouTube, the election was stolen. And again, reading the New York Times, YouTube, some are certain the election was fraudulent. Others aren't so sure. What becomes of their skepticism has important implications for American democracy. Let's see what the New York Times thinks is in store for people who think the election was stolen. Richard Everett walked with a heavy heart from his hotel to join a rally being held by President Trump's supporters near the White House on Saturday. The Supreme Court had rejected a lawsuit by Texas the night before, extinguishing what little hope he had left for the re-election of Mr. Trump, the man who had inspired the first vote of his life. Well, let's just be really clear about this. The Supreme Court chose not to hear a case brought by Texas that no one even knew Texas was bringing, based on the fact that it evaluated Texas did not have the standing to bring the case. Now, does that actually dismiss the case based on the merits of the case? No, had nothing to do with the merits of the case, and it's also not the last hope. And anyone who tells you that it is the last hope is lying to you. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that I think that Trump is a shoo-in, because I absolutely do not believe that Trump is a shoo-in. I'm been incredibly consistent with my stance since literally the day after Election Day, which is, I don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to happen either. And if anyone can pull this off, it is Donald Trump. So we're just going to have to wait it out and see. I almost didn't walk down after last night's announcement, he said Mr. Everett, 55, who lives in Western Pennsylvania. He likes what he said was Mr. Trump's knows. Isn't it funny that they don't call him President Trump in the New York Times? I never even thought about that before this whole stupid doctor debate. I never even thought about that. Not using his honorific, are you, New York Times? What he said was Mr. Trump knows something at the elites in both parties, many of whom had been in power for years and appeared to have grown rich from it. But on this day, he was resigned to losing him as president. At this point, it's over. You hate to say it. I mean, dude, you're wrong. It's literally not over. But okay, I mean, listen, like, if you want to give up on things, that's your choice. I don't know what's going to happen. I think that the things that they're working on are probably a long shot at best. But again, like, the minute that you give up, you literally have no chance of winning. So I completely support every single effort they are taking to do all the investigations, to send alternate slates of electors to Congress, which I'm sure the New York Times is actually not going to report. We're going to find out. I support all the efforts they're doing, and frankly, you should too. Supporters gathered for a similar event in November, shortly after the election, but this time the crowd at Freedom Plaza was far smaller and less hopeful, a mood that reflected a month of disappointments. I mean, I don't know what the crowd size was. I was pretty happy with what I didn't go to it, but I was pretty happy with what I saw from the crowd, because I always thought it was going to be smaller than November, purely because people already traveled out for November. You can't expect people to travel to DC every single month. And also, it's colder in December. Like, one of the reasons I didn't go, I was like, it's gonna be cold. I don't want to be out and about all day. Like, it was a beautiful day in November, and I just didn't want to go out in the cold. Yeah, I might be a little bit of a wuss, but whatever. So I completely understand that. But do I trust the New York Times to accurately report on the crowd size? No, because they didn't do it for the November rally. Mr. Trump has lost dozens of court cases. No, he hasn't. No, he hasn't. Lie number one, New York Times. No, he hasn't. The Trump campaign itself has filed like 3 different cases. All the cases that have been dismissed are not the ones that he has filed. The Supreme Court has rejected his cause twice. You notice they didn't say case twice, because both of the cases that the Supreme Court rejected, were not the ones brought by the Trump administration. That's lie number 2, New York Times. I'm going to have a lie meter. How many times is the New York Times going to lie in this article? And on Monday, the Electoral College gave the final legal stamp of approval to Mr. Trump's loss. That's lie number 3, New York Times. That is not the final step of approval. The final step of approval is when Congress, under the direction of the current Vice President, Mike Pence, he's the only one who has constitutional authority, when they confirm the electors. Now, what the New York Times isn't telling you, and probably isn't going to tell you in the course of this article, is that 7 different states are sending 2 different slates of electors to Congress, dependent upon the outcomes of the investigations that are still ongoing. They're still investigating the fraud in 7 different states. In all the different states, there's still hearings going on, there's still stuff happening, and they're sending 2 different slates of electors, one for Biden and one for Trump. And we're going to see which ones actually get confirmed, because no one knows the answer to that yet, even the New York Times. So we're now up to 3 on the lie meter for the New York Times. One thing has remained the same: the view among Mr. Trump's most faithful followers that he is the rightful winner of the election. And at this point, because I think that this article has already violated YouTube censorship guidelines, I'm just going to point out again, YouTube, that I am reading a New York Times article. If you censor this video, you are very literally censoring the New York Times. Polls have presented a stark picture of alternate realities. A Fox News poll released on Friday found that 77% of those who cast ballots for Mr. Trump said they thought the election had been stolen from him. Just 10% of Democrats agreed. Another survey conducted by Brightline Watch in late November found that among those who would approve of Mr. Trump's performance in office, about half believed that he, and not Joseph R. Biden Jr., would be inaugurated in January. But interviews with dozens more of people who voted for Mr. Trump reveal a more fluid picture. Some of the more diehard supporters who were hungry for any information to support Mr. Trump's claims, against all evidence, that's lie number 4, New York Times, lie number 4. There are mountains of evidence that anyone can see simply by watching the hearings that are publicly available. I got into a fight with someone on Facebook today that they were going after a friend of mine, and they were calling him all levels of stupid because of what he believes. And I said, have you watched any of the hearings that took place in Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, or Georgia? They said, yes, of course I've watched the hearings. And I said, well, why don't you tell me, give me some critique of a specific witness and their specific testimony at the hearings? And they were like, they had no idea what to say because they haven't watched the hearings, just like the New York Times, against all evidence. Lie number 4, New York Times. We're like 3 paragraphs into this article, dude. For those voters, no data could convince them otherwise. For New York Times reporters who refuse to watch hearings, no data can convince them that there's actual evidence when they're doing this with their eyes, like, no, I don't see any evidence. I don't know what evidence you're talking about. I don't see any evidence. Well, there isn't any evidence against all evidence. I don't see any evidence. That's what they're doing. I'm just saying. So we're up to like 4 or 5 lies now. I don't even know. Others are more uncertain. Nearly all of the people interviewed said they believed at least some fraud had been perpetuated, but whether that added up to Mr. Trump's being the true winner was much harder to know. The reasons for doubting the outcome were many. Misinformation played a role. Also did signaling by Republican leaders, first among Mr. Trump. Of course, they're not, again, mentioning the hearings at all. Not mentioning them at all. Partisan was power. Like, the New York Times thinks people are stupid. Here's the thing. The New York Times thinks you're stupid. The New York Times thinks that you don't have a brain of your own, that you are incapable of watching information, watching hearings, watching testimony, looking at data, looking at the election results. The New York Times thinks that you are incapable of doing any of this on your own, and they have to be the ones to tell you what the truth is. Well, what is the quote from 1984? He who controls the present controls the past. That's exactly what the New York Times is doing. They're literally erasing parts of history that don't serve the narrative they're trying to tell. Partisanship was powerful. Some were so distrustful of Democrats that they opened arguments about fraud, in large part because Democrats were not. Very similar to Democrats automatically being against anything and everything that Trump did. Isn't that funny? Isn't it funny that Trump would say, I have great hope for this medicine, for this therapeutic, and all of a sudden there'd be an article in the New York Times, this is never going to work. Trump says, I think we can have a vaccine by the end of the year. The New York Times, that would be a miracle, and no sources corroborate that there's going to be a vaccine by the end of the year. How'd that work out for you, New York Times? Still, others said election fraud was simply not that unusual a phenomenon. It's probably not, to be honest. And in a sign of how much Americans of both parties are living in political bubbles, many expressed the surprise that Mr. Biden could have won, given that they know no one who voted for him. Now, that's not a good argument about why Joe Biden could have won. A much better argument for why Joe Biden, might have struggled to get over 80 million votes is that the dude didn't campaign. He has dementia. He's senile, can barely speak in a coherent sentence. I can't even read on a teleprompter effectively, and spent months in his basement and only could attract like a dozen people to any of his rallies. I have a really hard time believing that resulted in 80 million votes, but that's just me. What do I know? Do I believe that Trump and Giuliani and their roadshow is 100% correct, said Richard Hauskamp, who owns a technology company in Grand Rapids, Michigan, referring to attempts by the president, look at that word choice, attempts by the president and his personal lawyer, Rudolph W. Giuliani, to present evidence of a stolen election. I'm not on board with that. But he's said he did not believe Michigan state officials when they said there was no evidence of fraud. That seems to me to be a pretty balanced opinion. Mr. Hauskamp said he did not think Mr. Trump would have won nationally, even after the allegations of fraud were accounted for, but he said all Americans should be open to hearing the arguments, and he was deeply frustrated that half of them were not. What happens next is a critical question for American democracy. What will become of the belief of that the 2020 election was in some way illegitimate? Will it melt away with Mr. Trump's prospects of winning and vanish completely when Mr. Biden is inaugurated? Dude, if you think that any of this is going to vanish completely after the inauguration, you are out of your ever-loving mind. This is going to be a 4-year fight because half of the country, no matter what happens, half of the country is not going to believe that the election was valid and that the president is going to be illegitimate, and it doesn't matter if it's Trump, it doesn't matter if it's Biden. If anyone thinks that this is going to disappear, then they're stupid. Will it fester, nursed by Republicans in power, and metastasize into something that could be a rallying cry for nationalists? Oh, so now they've already started to evoke it's the silly right-wing extremist nationalist narrative for years to come. It is the perception, often more than reality, that matters, says Keith A. Darden, political science professor at American University in Washington. If enough people believe that a government is not elected legitimately, that's a huge problem for democracy. That's 50% of the country, folks. No matter what happens, 50% of the country. And you know what? Like, let's just, YouTube, I'm going to throw you a bone. Let's just assume Biden's going to get in. Let's assume that that's going to be the outcome here. Whether or not it was fair, that's another story, but let's just assume that's going to be the outcome. 50% of the American public did not vote for him. 50% of the American public are going to be told for years and years and years, oh, you silly, stupid people. And the New York Times is one of the places that's going to be telling these people this. You silly people. You just can't listen to evidence. Don't you know? There's no evidence of voter fraud, you silly people. You think that's going to help? I'm going to say not, but what do I know? Mr. Darden, who studies Ukraine and Russia, so he's going to be... I'm not even going to tell you what my Ukrainian husband has said about this election, because that really will get this YouTube video banned, but you can go check my locals if you have any questions about that. I actually put a video of him saying exactly what he thinks in the uncensored land of locals. Sees parallels between the United States and countries he focuses on. Oh, do you? All the elected leaders who, for their own political gain, stroke conspiracies about terrible things on the other side is doing, as well as the deeply distrustful... You know what this guy's doing? This guy is actively making the claim that there's no election fraud in Ukraine and Russia. That's what he's doing. Okay, I need to read this again because I need to emphasize this point. This political scientist who studies Ukraine and Russia is making the argument in the New York Times that there's no election fraud in Ukraine and Russia. They all have elected leaders who, for their own political gain, stroke conspiracies about terrible things the other side is doing, as well as deeply distrustful societies that are unable to agree on basic facts or reach any kind of shared reality. Mr. Darden said the Republican leaders who encourage Mr. Trump's claims of a stolen election were going down a dangerous path, one whose end might be unpredictable. No election fraud in Ukraine and Russia. Okay. Okay, you people are moron. New York Times, I'm chalking that up as a lie purely because that's one of the stupidest things I've ever seen written in a major American newspaper in my life. Okay, here I am. There's the picture of me. Good spot for the people who spotted that picture because I wouldn't have even looked at it, to be honest. So good spot. I look like I'm very focused. This was when I was yelling at these protesters in the orange right here. I was giving it to those people good. That was actually pretty exciting for me. Anyway, let's keep going. Once reality gets degraded, it's really hard to bring it back. There are also some historical parallels in the United States, according to David Blight, a Civil War historian at Yale, who noted that in 1860, a number of southern states refused to accept the result of the election when Abraham Lincoln won. He pointed out summarily, turnout in the elections around the time was among the highest in the nation's history because, similar to the stakes people talk about today, the future of the republic was on the ballot. Well, guess what, dude? The side with the people that have the guns is not the side the New York Times is on, and that's good enough for me. Beyond the skepticism about who would take office in January, the voters who were interviewed voiced a growing and boldly held distrust of the American electoral system that Republicans in power have worked hard to encourage. Dude, most of the Republicans in power have not done diddly squat, which is why a lot of the people who support Trump are completely against the current GOP. This is something that people like leftists at the New York Times do not understand. The Republican Party is not a cohesive unit. The people who love Trump, they hate the establishment GOP. This is, I don't know, like, and if the New York Times ever got outside of its own little bubble, they would understand this. If they were actually talk to people who they disagreed with and actually listen to what they had to say, they would understand this. So I'm gonna chalk that up as lie number 7, New York Times. This is a lie based on like how little you guys understand about the right, but it is a lie nonetheless. It is a lie by omission or a lie by ignorance. My trust in elections is at an all-time low right now, says John Kenny, 55, a test prep instructor in Los Angeles who voted for Mr. Trump. I thought it was a pretty good system, and now I don't know who voted, or how they voted, or what they voted on, or who they voted, or who counted what. I just don't trust it. Mr. Kinney is a new Republican. He voted for Barack Obama twice. He did not vote in 2016 because he had been turned off by both candidates, but he voted for Mr. Trump this year after bristling at what he characterized as the left's growing intolerance for people like himself. You're white, so you have original sin, and you can never do anything about it except publicly apologize to everyone, and we will decide if you get to keep your career or not. He has a very good point there. Describing the attitude he associates with Democrats. He said he felt more certain of his party switch during the summer as protests sometimes turn violent and Democratic leaders, he said, failed to contain the chaos. What comes next? Trump's over, Mr. Kinney says. He's irrelevant. Oh, dude. But the Republicans aren't going to forget this. The resentments are going to remain. If you think that Donald Trump, regardless of what happens, is going to fade off into obscurity, Mr. Kinney does not fully understand what he's dealing with the right. Obviously, he's left rather recently, which I totally understand, because when I left the Democratic Party and started understanding the right, I didn't get this either. Like, Trump isn't going anywhere, dude. Trump is going to go, if Trump loses, Trump is going to go buy a network. He's going to keep running his mouth. If Twitter bans him, which they might do, I've got another video coming up on that in a little bit. But if they ban him, that Twitter is instantly going to become irrelevant because Trump is the only thing right now keeping Twitter alive. So if you think that Trump is going to become irrelevant, you simply don't understand what the new right actually is, and you aren't really paying attention. Mr. Everett, who went to the rally on Saturday, used to be a figure skater at the Ice Capades and now works in maintenance at a hotel. He didn't vote in 2016 either, but he said he went to the polls this time because he was worried Mr. Trump might not win, because he did not like the long-established leaders of both parties. You've lost touch with your people if you're pulling $100 of ice cream out of your freezer, he said, referring to a video this year of Speaker Nancy Pelosi showing her freezer packed with ice cream during the pandemic. Mr. Everett did not believe Mr. Biden won the election, but he was resigned to the fact that Mr. Biden would take office next month. Mr. Everett took a photo in front of the red bus that said March for Trump and then drove home to Pennsylvania. I probably won't vote again. He said Democrats will like that. Well, again, that's giving up, dude. These people who think I'm just never going to vote again because I didn't get the outcome I want. That's stupid, dude. That's stupid. Just how widespread is the belief that Mr. Trump was the real winner? In areas where Mr. Trump won an overwhelming majority of votes, very, voters said. Around here, everyone thinks the election was stolen from Trump, says Evelyn Atkins, 56, a bakery worker in Letcher County, Kentucky, where Mr. Trump won 79% of the vote. I think they always will say it was stolen from him. They will say they will not throw fits and burn buildings, but it will linger. It's not going to go away. And fewer people knowing or living around those on the other side of the political divide, the sense of suspicion is heightened. There's no doubt in my mind that it was rigged from the start, said Theda Kastner, a retired medical worker in Wisconsin. She said she was shocked that Mr. Biden got as many votes as he did in her county because she knew hardly anyone who voted for him. Every sign in her community had a Trump sign, adding to her skepticism about Mr. Biden's victory as a result in Arizona, a state she has lived in for more than 20 years. You notice they haven't mentioned literally any of the evidence that's come out in any of the hearings at all. This entire article is just to paint these crazy people as conspiracy theorists who have no basis. No basis other than they don't know anyone who voted for Joe Biden. That's the only thing that they have to go on, which is absolutely, emphatically not true. Believe me, Arizona is Republican, she said. I just sat there as the votes were coming in and I told John, she was referring to her husband, there's something wrong here. This is really screwed up. But many others were much less certain about the fraud allegations, even some who had attended the 2 rallies in Washington for Mr. Trump. I do think there was voter fraud, but I don't think there was massive voter fraud, says Anthony Cabasa, the chairman of the Republican National Hispanic Assembly of California, who attended both rallies. Does it add up to a Trump victory? That's where I'm not sure. He said Mr. Cabasa, a 33, a veteran of the Coast Guard, had never voted before 2020, but became involved in Republican politics in 2016 because he liked Mr. Trump's pitch that he was an outsider who went against the establishment. He said Democrats seem to have been after Mr. Trump from the start, first with the Russia investigation and then with the impeachment, and he saw the hypocrisy in the election complaints. I'm like, wait. How did we go from the most unsecure election with so much interference in 2016 to the Democrats saying this was the most honest election and all of a sudden we were supposed to 100% trust it, he said. That's a very good question, Anthony. But plenty of other supporters said they still believe Mr. Trump could prevail, like Julie Clavera, 63, a retired, I have no idea what that word is, very fancy doctor of some sort, who traveled 9 hours from Western North Carolina to attend the rally on Saturday. Trump may have something else up his sleeve, she said, wearing a mask and holding a large American flag. You never know. I'm going to hold out until January 20th. Mrs. Calavera says she was worried about what would happen during a Biden presidency. Mr. Biden, she said, is basically planning to get rid of our personal property and all of our freedoms. I don't believe that. I just don't believe that Joe Biden is going to do anyone any good at all. He's only going to be out for corporate interests. I mean, you can clearly see the people he's appointing to these positions. He's not going to do the average American people any good at all. He's going to raise their taxes. It's going to be particularly difficult for, average blue collar people. He might cancel some student debt, which I got to admit, I'm not actually I believe that you should pay back the student loans you took out, but am I going to complain if some of my student debt gets canceled? Probably not, to be honest with you. I'm not going to get the check back or anything. Mr. Trump is trying to stop that, she added, but every institution has obstructed him. I think it's a big coup against our country, she said. The FBI is involved, so is the CIA. It's crazy. Even the judges. Shortly after 12:15 p.m., she watched Mr. Trump fly overhead in a helicopter. Donald, we see you, buddy, shouted her husband, Kevin Haig, 67, a pastor and retired landscaper. She cheered too. After a while, she said, I think a lot of people are giving up. I'm not, but it's very discouraging. At the end of the day, we won't have a republic anymore. And I think maybe this is a good way to wrap it up. I think for people like the New York Times who really don't understand why people on the right are so up in arms about this, it's because you're chipping away at the fundamental, the foundations of our democracy, of the republic, of the Constitution. Every single day this nonsense goes on. Every single day the Democrats are arguing to take away more of the liberties that were granted to us by the Constitution. And this is a slippery slope. I think it's, I guess I take a little bit of solace in that I don't think there's going to be a civil war anytime soon. I believe there probably will be at some point if we keep going down this path, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. And maybe even there's something to be said for having a front row seat to the downfall of humanity as guided by the New York Times. How many lies did we get up to? Like 8 or 9? I don't even know. But it's the New York Times, so what are you gonna do? Alright guys, that's all I've got for this video. I'm sorry it was a little bit long. That article was longer than I thought it was, but I hope you enjoyed this little reaction to it to see inside the mind of the leftists at the New York Times. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel, turning on notifications, all that good stuff. That's all I've got for right now. I'll see you soon.